Welcome to another deep dive. This time into a topic that's, well, unsettling. Romantic nationalism, fabricated histories, and, yeah, the consequences, like ethnic cleansing. You've given us a lot to work with here, and you seem really interested in this idea of a nation state, how this idea, this self-determination thing, clashes with the reality of, well, diversity. Different ethnicities, languages, all that.
It's a fascinating paradox, isn't it?
It is.
This romantic nationalism taking off in the 19th, 20th centuries, fueled by this seemingly noble idea of self-determination. But look closer, and the whole foundation of a nation-state, this desire to create, well, homogenous entities, it's just flawed in a world with thousands of languages, ethnic groups. I mean, come on.
Yeah, it's like trying to force the whole world into these little boxes when it's really more like, I don't know, a tangled, messy, vibrant tapestry or something. And one of the sources for this deep dive, European revolutions and the Ottoman Balkans, shows how historical narratives were, I guess you could say, rewritten to fit these nationalistic agendas. Take the Orlov Revolt, for example, a Russian-backed uprising against the Ottomans way back in the 18th century. But later, it was recast as, this heroic Greek struggle for independence. History gets a makeover.
And imagining the Balkans adds another layer to that. It talks about how even the educated elite in the Balkans, they were dealing with multiple identities, ethnic, national, religious. It really throws a wrench in this idea of a singular Balkan identity. Like, it just doesn't reflect the reality of how people actually live and experience the world.
No, it doesn't.
It's way more complex.
Yeah, like trying to define the whole ocean by just one drop of water. And this clash between romantic nationalism and, well, just the reality of diversity has had consequences, sometimes tragic ones. Armenia's Secrets of a Christian Terrorist State brought that home for me. It looks at the relocation of Armenians by the Ottomans during World War I, an event often called a genocide. But here's where it gets interesting. The book argues it was a strategic relocation, not ethnic cleansing. And it points to Ottoman tax records suggesting a much smaller Armenian population than is commonly claimed. Makes you wonder about how the same event can be portrayed so differently, depending on who's telling the story, right? What their motivations are.
Absolutely. It raises some big questions about historical narratives, like how often are events reframed or even, completely fabricated to justify actions in the present? And how do we as individuals sort through these conflicting accounts? Claiming Crimea offers another example of this. Catherine the Great's annexation wasn't just about land, it was about trade routes, resources. But she spun it as reclaiming rightful Russian territory.
Classic power move.
Right. It reminds us that history is often written by the victors, so we should always be a little skeptical, look for more than one side to the story.
Yeah, like a big game of historical telephone where the story changes every time it's told.
Yeah, exactly.
And sadly, this clash between ideology and reality often leads to violence, especially when we look at ethnic cleansing. Our source, Death and Exile. The ethnic cleansing of Ottoman Muslims 1821-1922 shows the massive scale of forced migrations and deaths during that period. Millions of Muslims expelled from the Balkans and the Caucasus. There's one story in the book that really got to me. During the Russo-Turkish War, Russian troops deliberately targeted civilians to make Turkish villagers flee out of fear. Imagine the terror being driven from your home like that.
Awful. And we have to remember that this brutality isn't limited to one conflict or region. Ethnic cleansing in the Balkans challenges this idea that Balkan violence is somehow, inherently Balkan. It argues these acts are rooted in the logic of nation building, this pursuit of ethnic homogeneity. It's tough truth. These atrocities can happen anywhere, anytime, when fear and the desire for power take over.
Absolutely. And when you factor in propaganda and how it shapes perceptions, it gets even more disturbing. Dismantling the Ottoman Empire digs into how propaganda, especially in the West, influenced how events like the Armenian relocation were viewed, highlighting the impact of missionary reports and publications by people like Arnold Toynbee, who often presented a very particular and possibly biased view.
It's a good reminder that outside forces can be incredibly influential in shaping narratives, even justifying interventions.
It makes you wonder how much of what we believe about history, even today, is shaped by people with agendas, people who want to control the narrative.
It's a question worth asking for sure. It makes you think, doesn't it? How easily our understanding of history can be, manipulated. And the Armenian file really brings that home. It presents a totally different take on those events in 1915. It features Mathios Mirlian's perspective, directly challenging those genocide claims.
It's like looking at two sides of the same coin, each telling a totally different story.
Exactly.
And it really highlights how important it is to actively seek out different perspectives, even ones that challenge our preconceived notions.
Absolutely. History is rarely black and white, right? It's full of these nuances, complexities that can easily get lost in the effort to create one single narrative.
Yeah, the simplified version, the Ottoman peoples and the end of empire, that one really painted a picture of this. It looks at the huge demographic shifts and population losses after the Balkan Wars and World War I. Millions of people displaced, entire communities disappearing.
And these weren't just numbers on a page. These were real people, families, whose lives were completely uprooted, tragically cut short. The whole cultural landscape of the region changed forever.
And the effects are still felt today. The book talks about how these events shaped the foreign policy of the newly formed Turkish Republic, pushing it towards neutrality.
Like a collective trauma echoing through generations.
It makes you realize that understanding these historical events isn't just an academic exercise. It's about recognizing these patterns of nationalism, ethnic cleansing, fabricated narratives, patterns that are still playing out in the world today.
And it raises a really important question. Can we break free from these cycles of violence and division, or are we doomed to keep repeating the mistakes of the past?
That's a heavy one. But before we go there, I want to circle back to the human cost of these clashes. Millions of Muslims were driven from their homes in the Balkans and the Caucasus. It's a story of immense suffering that often gets overshadowed.
Absolutely, and it challenges this simple idea of a clear divide between victims and perpetrators. History rarely fits into those neat boxes. Death and exile really brought that home, especially with its account of the Russo-Turkish War. Remember that. The deliberate targeting of civilians to spread terror and drive out the Muslim population. Sadly, it's a tactic that's been used again and again throughout history.
It's just heartbreaking to imagine what those families went through, forced from their homes, their lives shattered.
And ethnic cleansing in the Balkans makes a really important point about how these acts are often justified by dehumanizing the other. Labeling them as threats, invaders, to make it easier to carry out these acts of cruelty.
It's scary how easily fear and prejudice can be used for political purposes, even today.
Absolutely. And that's why understanding these historical events is so crucial. It's about recognizing these patterns of violence and exclusion so we can hopefully break free from them.
And speaking of patterns, we can't forget about propaganda and how it influences what people believe. Dismantling the Ottoman Empire does a great job of showing how certain narratives gain traction in the West, especially around the Armenian relocation.
The influence of those missionary reports and the work of people like Arnold Toynbee, it's undeniable. It really emphasizes the need for us to be critical of the information we consume, especially when it comes to these emotionally charged events.
It's like we always have to be asking ourselves, who benefits from this particular story? What are their agendas?
Exactly. We have to seek out multiple perspectives. Listen to those voices that are often silenced or marginalized.
The Armenian file, with Mathios Mirlian's account, is a perfect example of that. It's a different lens on the events of 1915, one that challenges the accepted narrative. And while it doesn't necessarily invalidate other points of view, it shows how important it is to engage with a variety of perspectives, even the ones that might make us uncomfortable.
Right. Because history is messy, it's complicated. Reducing it to simple narratives doesn't do justice to the truth or to the people who live through these events.
It stops us from truly learning from the past.
Exactly.
The Ottoman peoples and the end of empire really drives that home by looking at the profound demographic shifts and population losses after the Balkan Wars and World War I. Millions displaced, communities vanishing.
It's a reminder that these events weren't just some abstract happenings in a history book. They involved real people, families whose lives were forever changed. And they continue to have these ripple effects, shaping the political landscape of the region and the world.
Almost like a wound that never fully heals.
Exactly. And recognizing that is the first step towards understanding how to move forward.
So where do we go from here? How do we deal with this legacy of ethnic cleansing and fabricated histories? What can we learn from all of this to create a more just and equitable future?
Those are the questions we need to be asking, and maybe the answers lie in understanding the deeper roots of these issues.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into this whole, romantic nationalism thing. Ethnic cleansing, the power of fabricated histories. We've gone through a lot. from the historical roots to the manipulation of narratives, the human cost.
Hmm.
But we don't want to leave you feeling like overwhelmed or hopeless. We want to shift gears now, focus on what we can learn from all this
Yeah.
and how we can use it to build a better, more just and equitable future.
Yeah, history can be, well, heavy, but it can also be a source of wisdom, a way to find a better path forward.
One thing that really struck me going through these sources was the importance of individual stories. How they can challenge those big, sweeping narratives and force us to see the human side of these, well, often abstract historical events.
Definitely.
The Armenian File, with Mathios's Myrlian story, is a perfect example. Challenges the dominant narrative about the events of 1915, makes us rethink our assumptions.
Right. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles and political movements. It's about people's lives, their hopes, struggles, losses. And those stories, they have the power to, well, humanize the other, break down stereotypes, create empathy where there might be division.
Yeah, it's like stepping into someone else's shoes, seeing the world through their eyes, even if it challenges our own perspective.
Exactly.
And we see this in Death and Exile, too, with those accounts of Muslim families driven from their homes, facing incredible hardship. It's a side of the story that often gets, overlooked, especially in Western accounts.
Yeah, for sure. And it highlights another important point. Recognizing the diversity of experiences within any group. Imagining the Balkans does a great job showing how the Balkans aren't just this, monolithic region. They don't have one single history or culture.
No, definitely not. It's more like a tapestry with tons of threads woven together, different ethnicities, languages, religions, traditions, and recognizing that complexity is key to understanding, well, everything about the region, its history, its present.
It's about moving beyond those simple, us versus them divisions. It's about seeing each other as individuals with unique experiences, not just representatives of a group.
Absolutely. And education plays a huge role in this. Not the kind that just pushes one narrative, but the kind that encourages critical thinking, questioning assumptions, talking to people with different views.
Couldn't agree more.
Dismantling the Ottoman Empire, that one really brought this home for me.
Yeah.
It shows how propaganda, even in the West, shaped perceptions of the region, especially around the Armenian relocation. It's a reminder of how easily narratives can be manipulated, history rewritten for political reasons.
Right, like a cautionary tale.
It is. It's a call for, media literacy, being able to evaluate sources, recognize bias, separate fact from fiction.
Especially in today's world with so much information flying around.
Exactly. We have to understand that history is always written from a certain perspective. And there's always more than one side to the story. And we have to be willing to question the narratives we've inherited, challenge those assumptions we grew up with, even when it's uncomfortable.
It can be tough.
It can. But clinging to those comfortable narratives, even if they're based on, misinformation or incomplete understanding, it can lead to the same cycles of division and violence we've been talking about.
Exactly. It's a process, questioning and unlearning. But it's crucial if we want to break free from the past and build a better future.
And it's not just about the past. It's about the present, the future. The legacy of romantic nationalism, ethnic cleansing, fabricated histories, it's still unfolding. Conflicts around the world today.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Ottoman peoples and the end of empire, it reminds us that those demographic shifts, the population losses, they weren't just abstract events. These were real people, families whose lives were changed forever. And the effects of those events are still felt.
Like ripples spreading outwards.
Yeah, exactly. So what can we do? How can we, as individuals, make a difference in a world that feels, overwhelmed by these issues?
Well, I think it starts with each of us. Being curious, asking questions, challenging the status quo, listening to people different from us, seeking out diverse perspectives, being willing to change our minds.
Recognizing our shared humanity. We're all connected. What happens to one of us affects us all.
And maybe most importantly, believing that a better future is possible. That we can break free from these cycles of violence and division, choosing hope over despair, action over apathy.
Powerful stuff. So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a sense of, possibility and responsibility, a call to action. Understanding history isn't just about the past. It's about shaping the future. And that's something we all have a part in.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on this journey. We hope it's made you think, challenged your views, inspired you to keep exploring these issues. The pursuit of knowledge, understanding, it's a lifelong thing. And it has the power to change, everything. Ourselves, the world around us.
It really does.